I was kneeling in my small backyard garden in suburban Ohio, tending to the rose bushes my mother had planted before she passed away 3 years ago. The Saturday morning air was crisp and peaceful, just the way I loved it. Then the doorbell rang, shattering that tranquility. I frowned, setting down my watering can. Nobody really knew I lived here except a few close friends. Who could possibly be visiting at 8 in the morning? Before I tell you what happened next, let me know what city you are watching from. And please hit that like button if you have ever experienced an unwelcome surprise that changed everything. Now let me take you back to that moment that turned my quiet life upside down. To understand what happened that morning, I need to take you back to my complicated family history. My mother, Sarah, raised me mostly alone after my biological father abandoned us when I was just 5 years old. When I turned 8, she married David, a man who seemed kind enough but came with baggage of his own. He had a daughter from his previous marriage named Madison, who was 3 years younger than me, but carried herself like she owned the world. From the moment David and Madison moved into our house, Madison made it crystal clear that I was not welcome in what she considered her new territory. She would hide my toys, tell David lies about things I supposedly did wrong, and throw tantrums whenever my mother tried to include me in family activities. My mother, bless her heart, tried her best to create harmony between us, but Madison was determined to make my life miserable. The situation reached a breaking point when Madison turned 16. After a particularly nasty argument where she screamed at my mother for always choosing Joanna over your real family, Madison packed her bags and left. David was devastated, but Madison refused all attempts at reconciliation. She cut off contact, completely changing her phone number and blocking us on every social media platform. For 17 long years, we heard nothing from her. She did not call on birthdays, did not send Christmas cards, and most painfully, she did not even show up for my mother's funeral 3 years ago. My mother had hoped until her final days that Madison would come back, that they could somehow repair their broken relationship. But Madison's silence was deafening. When I opened that front door on that Saturday morning, I felt like I was seeing a ghost. Madison stood on my doorstep, but she was completely transformed from the angry teenager who had stormed out all those years ago. Her hair was now platinum blonde, styled in an expensive cut that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She wore designer clothes and carried a purse that I recognized from a magazine as costing several $1,000s. Standing behind her was a man I assumed was her husband, tall and broad-shouldered, with cold eyes that seemed to be appraising everything they saw. 2 small children clung to his sides, a little girl who looked about 7, and a boy who could not have been more than 5. "Hello, Joanna," Madison said, her voice carrying the same icy tone I remembered from our childhood. "I am Madison, in case you have forgotten. This is my husband, Greg, and our children, Lily and Jake." I was so stunned that I could barely speak. "Madison, I cannot believe it. After all these years, how did you even find me here?" "It was not that difficult," she replied with a slight smirk. "Public records are quite helpful when you know what to look for. May we come in? I would like to show Greg and the children where I grew up." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let them enter. Madison walked through the house like she was conducting an inspection, pointing out different rooms to her family, while I trailed behind them, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. "This was my father's study," she said, gesturing to the small office where David used to pay bills. "And this was where we had family dinners." She paused in the dining room, running her fingers along the wooden table that my mother had saved up to buy. What disturbed me most was how Greg seemed to be taking mental notes of everything. He asked casual questions about when certain renovations had been done, whether the roof had been replaced recently, and what the property taxes were like in this neighborhood. When I asked why he was so interested, he just shrugged and said he worked in real estate. But it was Madison's behavior that really set off alarm bells in my head. When she thought I was not looking, I caught her taking photos of different rooms with her phone. She was particularly interested in the master bedroom, where she stood for several minutes examining the vintage furniture that had belonged to my mother. As they were preparing to leave, Madison made a comment that sent chills down my spine. "This house holds so many memories," she said, looking directly into my eyes. "It has been in the wrong hands for far too long. Perhaps it is time for it to return to its rightful owner. I tried to convince myself that she was just being nostalgic, that seeing her childhood home again had brought up complicated emotions. But the cold calculation in her eyes told a different story entirely. The week following Madison's unexpected visit was unlike anything I had ever experienced. What started as isolated incidents quickly escalated into a pattern of behavior that left me feeling like a stranger in my own home. Madison began showing up at my door with increasing frequency, each time with a different excuse for her presence. The first time she claimed she needed to retrieve some of David's personal belongings that might still be stored in the basement. I let her search even though I knew perfectly well that I had packed up and donated all of David's remaining items years ago. The second visit came just 3 days later. This time, Madison insisted she needed to check the mailbox for any correspondence that might still be arriving for David. When I pointed out that David had not lived here for over a decade and that the Postal Service had long since updated their records, she became defensive and accused me of trying to keep his mail from reaching him. It was during her third visit that Madison's true intentions became impossible to ignore. She arrived carrying a tape measure and a notebook, claiming she wanted to help me with some home improvement projects. But instead of discussing renovations, she spent 2 hours measuring every room in the house, while taking detailed notes about square footage and structural features. When I confronted her about this strange behavior, Madison looked me straight in the eye and said, "I am just trying to understand what this place is really worth." After all, it was my home, too. The way she emphasized the word "was" made my stomach turn. But Madison was not content to limit her activities to the inside of my house. I began noticing her having lengthy conversations with my neighbors, Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Chen, both elderly residents who had lived on our street for decades. When I asked Mrs. Patterson what Madison had wanted to know, she looked confused and said, "That nice young woman said she was your sister. She was asking about the history of your house when it was built, whether there had ever been any legal disputes about the property lines." The situation took an even more disturbing turn when David called me for the first time since my mother's funeral. I was so shocked to hear his voice that I almost dropped the phone. "Joanna, we need to talk," he said without any pleasantries. "Madison has been filling me in on some concerning information about Sarah's will." "What do you mean concerning information?" I asked, my heart beginning to race. "Well, Madison seems to think there might have been some irregularities in how that will was executed. She is my blood daughter after all, and she believes she has legitimate claims to the family property that were overlooked." I could not believe what I was hearing. "David, you know perfectly well that my mother left everything to me. The will was properly executed by a licensed attorney. There were witnesses present when she signed it. Now, Joanna, I am not saying anyone did anything wrong intentionally," David continued in a patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. "But Madison has been talking to some legal experts, and they think there might be grounds to challenge the will if certain procedures were not followed correctly." The implicit threat in his words was unmistakable. I hung up the phone with my hands shaking, finally understanding that Madison was not just visiting out of nostalgia or even simple greed. She was mounting a calculated attack on my legal right to live in the home my mother had left me. I immediately called Eleanor Watson, the family attorney who had handled my mother's estate. Eleanor had been practicing law for over 30 years and had a reputation for being both thorough and honest. "Joanna, honey, you have nothing to worry about," Eleanor assured me after I explained the situation. "Your mother's will is absolutely airtight. I made sure of that. Sarah was of completely sound mind when she signed it. We had 2 independent witnesses present, and everything was filed properly with the county courthouse." But then Eleanor's tone became more serious. "However, I want you to be aware that people can still file frivolous lawsuits even when they have no legitimate grounds. It costs money and time to defend against these kinds of challenges, even when you ultimately win." Her words proved prophetic. That same afternoon, I learned that Madison had retained the services of Hartwell and Associates, a law firm that specialized in inheritance disputes and had a reputation for taking on cases that other attorneys would not touch. When Madison showed up at my door the next morning with Greg and the children in tow, her demeanor had changed completely. Gone was any pretense of family reconciliation or nostalgic reminiscence. Instead, she had the confident bearing of someone who believed they held all the cards. "We need to discuss the living arrangements," she announced as she walked past me into the house without waiting for an invitation. "What living arrangements?" I asked, following them into what had been my peaceful living room. "Greg and I have been looking for a larger place for our family," Madison replied, settling onto my couch like she owned it. "The children are getting older and we need more space. Since this house has been sitting here with just one person rattling around in it, we think it makes sense for the whole family to move back in." I stared at her in disbelief. "Madison, this is my home. I am not looking for roommates." Madison's expression hardened. "Actually, Joanna, that remains to be seen. Our legal research has uncovered some very interesting facts about how this property was transferred. Did you know that in Ohio, children have certain rights to family property that cannot be easily dismissed?" Greg nodded along with everything Madison said while their children began running around the house, touching everything and knocking over decorative items that had belonged to my mother. When I asked them to be more careful, Madison snapped, "They are just children being children in what may very well turn out to be their own home." As the family finally prepared to leave that evening, Madison delivered what felt like a final ultimatum. "You know, Joanna, this could all be settled very amicably if you would just be reasonable about things. Greg has found several nice apartments in town that would be perfect for a single person. Much more practical than trying to maintain this big old house all by yourself." I realized then that Madison had not come back into my life seeking reconciliation or closure. She had come back to take everything my mother had worked so hard to provide for me, and she was prepared to use every weapon at her disposal to make that happen. What followed was the most devastating month of my entire life. Madison's legal assault began in earnest, and with it came a level of betrayal and manipulation that I could never have imagined. The first blow came in the form of an official lawsuit filed against me in county court. Madison was claiming that my mother's will had been executed under duress, alleging that I had manipulated a sick woman into changing her estate plans to benefit me exclusively. According to the legal documents, Madison was seeking to have the will declared invalid and the property distributed according to Ohio's intestacy laws, which would give David's biological daughter a significant claim to the estate. But Madison was not content to fight this battle solely in the courtroom. She had also embarked on a campaign to systematically destroy my credibility and isolate me from everyone I trusted. The evidence she presented seemed damning on the surface. She had somehow obtained copies of text messages allegedly sent from my phone to my mother during her final illness messages that showed me discussing financial matters and pressuring my mother to make sure the house papers were in order. The problem was I had never sent those messages. The phone numbers were correct, the dates aligned with my mother's illness, but the words were not mine. Madison had also procured sworn statements from two people claiming to be former caregivers who had witnessed me coaching my mother on what to say to attorneys and becoming angry when my mother expressed doubts about leaving everything to me. I had never seen these people before in my life, but their testimony was detailed and convincing. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Madison had hired a private investigator who began documenting my every move. I would find the man parked across the street from my house at all hours, photographing me as I left for work, returned from grocery shopping, or worked in my garden. When I confronted him, he simply handed me a business card and said he was gathering evidence for a legal proceeding. But Madison's most devastating attack was yet to come. One morning, I woke up to find that she had somehow managed to change the locks on my back door during the night. When I called to demand an explanation, she calmly informed me that she was securing the property pending resolution of the legal dispute. You cannot just change the locks on my house, I told her, my voice rising with panic and anger. Actually, I can, Madison replied. I have filed an emergency motion with the court requesting temporary custody of the property due to concerns about your mental stability. Until the judge rules on that motion, I am legally authorized to take reasonable steps to protect the family assets. I rushed to the courthouse to obtain copies of the emergency motion Madison had filed. What I read there made me feel physically sick. Madison had painted a picture of me as an unstable, potentially dangerous person who had isolated my mother from her family and coerced her into changing her will. She claimed that I had a history of erratic behavior and that several neighbors had expressed concerns about my fitness to maintain the property. When I called Eleanor Watson in a panic, she tried to reassure me, but I could hear the concern in her voice. These are very serious allegations, Joanna. Even though they are completely false, we are going to have to address each one systematically. This is going to be an expensive and time-consuming process. But Madison was not finished. Her next target was my support system. She had somehow tracked down Emma and Tyler, my two closest friends since college, and had reached out to them with a carefully crafted story about her concerns for my well-being. According to Madison's version of events, I had become increasingly isolated and paranoid since my mother's death. She told my friends that I had been making disturbing comments about not trusting anyone, and that she was worried I might be having a mental health crisis. She even provided them with examples of supposedly erratic text messages I had sent her, messages that I had never actually written. Emma called me one evening with worry clear in her voice. Joanna, your sister reached out to me and Tyler. She says she is really concerned about you. She thinks you might need some professional help. Emma Madison is not my sister. She is my stepsister, and she is trying to steal my house, I explained desperately. She has been harassing me for weeks and filing false legal documents. But I could hear the doubt in Emma's voice when she replied. She seemed really genuine, Joanna, and she knew a lot of details about your life that someone would only know if they were really close to you. Maybe you should consider talking to someone just to make sure you are processing your grief in a healthy way. When Tyler stopped returning my phone calls altogether, I realized that Madison had succeeded in making even my closest friends question my sanity and stability. The final blow came 3 weeks after the legal proceedings began. I returned home from a particularly difficult day at work to find Greg's pickup truck in my driveway and several pieces of furniture on my front porch. When I unlocked my front door, I discovered that Madison had moved her family into my house. "What is this?" I demanded, finding Madison calmly preparing dinner in my kitchen while her children watched television in my living room. "The court granted our emergency motion," Madison replied without looking up from the stove. "We have been awarded temporary residence in the family home while the legal proceedings are ongoing. You are welcome to remain in the upstairs bedroom for now, but the rest of the house is off limits to you until this matter is resolved." I felt like the walls were closing in around me. In the space of just a few weeks, Madison had managed to take control of my home, poison my friendships, and create a legal situation that could drag on for months or even years. I was trapped in my own house, watching strangers live in the rooms where I had grown up and where my mother had spent her final years. That night, sitting alone in my childhood bedroom while I listened to Madison's family laughing and talking downstairs, I reached my breaking point. I pulled out the photo album that contained pictures of my mother and me throughout the years, and I remembered the last conversation we had had before she died. "This house is yours, Joanna," she had whispered to me from her hospital bed. "I worked my whole life to make sure you would have a place that belonged to you. Do not let anyone take that away from you." In that moment, I realized that I had been approaching this entire situation all wrong. I had been trying to defend myself against Madison's attacks, but I had not been fighting back. I had been reactive instead of proactive, responding to her moves instead of making my own. Madison thought she could bully and manipulate her way into stealing everything my mother had built for me. She was about to learn that she had seriously underestimated the daughter of the woman who had raised me to never give up on what was right. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity and determination I had not felt since this nightmare began. Instead of wallowing in self-pity or hoping the system would somehow protect me, I decided to take control of my own destiny and fight fire with fire. My first call was to Marcus Rodriguez, a private investigator who had been recommended by a colleague at work. Marcus had spent 20 years as a detective with the Columbus Police Department before starting his own investigation firm, and he had a reputation for being both thorough and discreet. "I need you to find out everything there is to know about Madison Hartwell," I told him during our initial meeting. "I want to know where she has been for the past 17 years, how she makes her money, what her legal history looks like, and whether she has ever pulled anything like this before." Marcus listened carefully to my story and agreed to take the case. "In my experience," he said, "people who are willing to go this far to steal someone else's property usually have a history of similar behavior. Give me 2 weeks, and I will have a complete picture of who you are really dealing with." While Marcus began his investigation, I turned my attention to Madison's legal strategy. I had been assuming that her lawsuit was simply frivolous, but I realized I needed to understand exactly how she was planning to attack my mother's will. I hired Sandra Kellerman, one of the most respected estate litigation attorneys in Ohio, to review all of Madison's filings and develop a comprehensive defense strategy. Sandra's analysis was both reassuring and sobering. "Your mother's will is absolutely valid," she confirmed. "But Madison is not just challenging the will itself. She is trying to create a narrative that you manipulated your mother through elder abuse and undue influence. If she can convince a jury that your mother was coerced or mentally incompetent when she signed the will, she might be able to get it overturned." "But my mother was completely mentally sharp until the end," I protested. "She was making complex decisions about her medical care right up until she passed away." "I believe you," Sandra replied, "but Madison has fabricated evidence that suggests otherwise. We need to prove that her evidence is fraudulent, and that means conducting our own investigation into how these fake text messages and false witness statements were created." The breakthrough came during Marcus's second week of investigation. He called me with excitement, clear in his voice. "Joanna, you are not going to believe what I found. Madison has a criminal record in Florida from 5 years ago. She was convicted of financial fraud for creating fake documents to steal money from an elderly man she was supposed to be caring for. She served 18 months in prison and was ordered to pay restitution. This was the ammunition I had been hoping for, but Marcus was just getting started. "It gets better," he continued. "The fake text messages Madison submitted as evidence. I traced them back to a company in Miami that specializes in creating fabricated digital communications for people involved in legal disputes. It is completely illegal, but apparently Madison thought she could get away with it because the company operates in a legal gray area." "What about the witness statements?" I asked. "Both of those so-called caregivers are actually actors that Madison hired through a temp agency. I have copies of their contracts and payment records. One of them even has a LinkedIn profile where she lists courtroom testimony as one of her special skills." Armed with this evidence, Sandra and I requested an emergency hearing to present our findings to the judge. The hearing was scheduled for the following Friday, and I spent the week preparing for what I hoped would be the final battle in this war Madison had started. The day of the hearing, I arrived at the courthouse feeling nervous but confident. Madison sat at the opposing counsel's table, looking as composed as ever, but I noticed that Greg was not with her. Marcus's investigation had revealed that Greg had filed for divorce the moment he learned about Madison's criminal history, and he was currently seeking custody of their children. When Sandra stood up to present our evidence, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed dramatically. She methodically dismantled every piece of Madison's case, showing the judge proof that the text messages were fabricated, that the witnesses were paid actors, and that Madison had a documented history of using fraud to steal property from vulnerable people. The judge's reaction was swift and decisive. Not only did she dismiss Madison's lawsuit entirely, but she also ordered Madison to pay all of my legal fees and court costs. More importantly, She referred the case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution for perjury and fraud. Ms. Hartwell, the judge said, looking directly at Madison with obvious disgust. This court has rarely seen such a calculated and malicious abuse of the legal system. You have committed multiple felonies in your attempt to defraud Miss Joanna of her rightful inheritance, and you will face the full consequences of your actions. Madison's face went white as the judge continued. You are hereby ordered to vacate Miss Joanna's property immediately and to have no further contact with her. Any violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and prosecution for contempt of court. As we left the courthouse that day, I felt a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and vindication that I could barely process. Madison's scheme had collapsed completely, and she was facing serious legal consequences for her actions. But more than that, I had proven to myself that I was capable of fighting back against even the most calculated and ruthless attacks. The weeks that followed brought a steady stream of good news. Greg not only filed for divorce, but also provided testimony to prosecutors about Madison's fraudulent activities, which resulted in additional charges being filed against her. David, apparently horrified by what his daughter had done, publicly disavowed her actions and even sent me a letter apologizing for the pain she had caused. Most importantly, Emma and Tyler reached out to apologize for doubting me. When they learned the full truth about Madison's manipulation and lies, they were mortified by how easily they had been deceived. "We should have trusted you from the beginning," Emma said when she came to visit me. "You have never given us any reason to doubt your honesty or stability. Madison was just incredibly convincing." The healing process took time, but I found myself becoming stronger and more confident as each day passed. I began attending a support group for people who had survived family financial abuse, where I met others who had faced similar situations. Sharing our stories and learning from each other's experiences helped me understand that Madison's behavior was not a reflection of my own failings, but rather a pattern of predatory conduct that targeted vulnerable people. I also threw myself into renovating and improving the house that Madison had tried so hard to steal from me. Each room I painted and each repair I completed felt like an act of reclamation, a way of making the space truly mine again after months of feeling like an intruder in my own home. But perhaps the most important lesson I learned through this entire ordeal was about the difference between family and blood relation. Madison and I had shared a household for several years during our childhood, but we had never been family in any meaningful sense. Family is built on love, respect, and mutual support, not on legal documents or shared living spaces. The people who truly proved themselves to be family during this crisis were Emma and Tyler, who came back to support me once they understood the truth. My colleagues at work, who offered both emotional support and practical help when I needed it most. Even Marcus and Sandra, who went above and beyond their professional obligations to ensure that justice was served. Madison, meanwhile, faced the full consequences of her actions. She was ultimately sentenced to 2 years in prison for fraud and perjury, and she lost custody of her children permanently when the court determined that her willingness to commit felonies made her an unfit parent. David, devastated by his daughter's choices, moved to Arizona to live near his sister and has had no contact with Madison since her sentencing. As I sit here today, 3 months after the judge's ruling, I feel a sense of peace and gratitude that would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of Madison's assault on my life. I have learned that protecting what belongs to you is not selfish or greedy, but rather an act of self-respect and honor for those who work to provide for you. My mother spent her entire adult life working to create security and stability for me. When Madison tried to steal that legacy through lies and manipulation, she was not just attacking my property, but attacking my mother's memory and everything she had sacrificed to give me a better life. Standing up to Madison was not just about keeping a house, though the house certainly matters to me. It was about refusing to let someone rewrite history to suit their own selfish purposes. It was about defending the truth against people who think they can create their own version of reality through intimidation and fraud. I have also learned that sometimes the people who should love and protect you are the ones most willing to hurt you for their own gain. Blood relationships do not automatically create loyalty or affection, and shared history does not guarantee shared values or mutual respect. But most importantly, I learned that I am stronger and more capable than I ever knew. When everything I valued was under attack, when even my closest friends were questioning my sanity, when it seemed like Madison held all the cards and I had no way to fight back, I found reserves of courage and determination that I did not know I possessed. I think about that lesson. Often, as I tend to the rose garden my mother planted, the same garden where I was working on that Saturday morning when Madison first appeared at my door. The roses have bloomed more beautifully this year than ever before, as if they too have benefited from the peace and security that came after the storm. Sometimes the greatest growth comes from the most challenging circumstances, and sometimes the most important battles are the ones we never expected to fight. What matters is not whether we choose these battles, but how we respond when they choose us. Have you ever had to stand up to someone who tried to take what rightfully belonged to you? Or have you faced a situation where family members turned against you when you least expected it? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. Please hit that like button if this story resonated with you, and do not forget to subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming challenges and finding strength in difficult times. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that they are stronger than they know. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and I hope it reminds you that no matter how impossible a situation might seem, there is always a way to fight back and protect what matters most to you. May you always have the courage to stand up for your truth and the wisdom to know when to fight and when to let go.